It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the BenQ EW3280U. This video, as usual, accompanies a written review, and you can find a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. As usual for a video, what you see depends on my camera, it depends on my video editing software, it depends on the processing done by YouTube, and ultimately, and very importantly, it depends on the output of the screen that you're watching the video on, so in no way does it accurately represent what the monitor actually looks like firsthand. This monitor uses a 31.5-inch AH3A Advanced Hyper Viewing Angle IPS type panel. This has a 4K UHD, that's 3840 by 2160 resolution, and this combination of resolution and screen size gives what I feel is a really nice pixel density, a nice amount of desktop real estate. I don't use any scaling, so I use 100% scaling in Windows. I don't use application-specific zoom, but things are quite small. You can see the desktop icons are rather small, and this does give you an excellent amount of desktop real estate, but some users might like to use some scaling. But you can get away with using less scaling than you would on smaller UHD monitors. So in terms of the multitasking potential, really good. You can get lots of nice, crisp, small text, small but readable. Again, you might want to use a bit of scaling or application-specific zoom depending on your preferences. The clarity is really good, and the volume of text you can get on the screen. The detail levels of suitably high-resolution image content is good as well, and that's not just on the desktop, but when you're playing games, you're watching suitably high-resolution movie content as well. But certainly for games, you can really appreciate that detail, and it does give what I call a sort of a 4K look to things. And in that respect, it's really very similar to using a smaller 4K monitor, in my view, such as a 27-inch model. So the pixel density is definitely high enough to give that kind of look. And I describe that a bit more in the written review. Something else I always like to mention quite early on in my video reviews is the screen surface, and that's very light matte anti-glare. So that means that the image isn't impeded as much as it is on stronger matte anti-glare screen surfaces. Things don't look like you're viewing them through a kind of window. It doesn't have an obvious smeary graininess or a sort of heavy graininess. It looks fairly smooth if you're observing lighter image content rather than looking overly grainy. There's what I'd call a fine misty graininess. I haven't actually chosen this wallpaper myself, it just randomly cycled to it, but it seems quite appropriate when I'm talking about misty graininess. But what this is it's just a very fine, light, sort of misty quality to the screen rather than a coarse sandiness or anything that is particularly obtrusive. And I'm quite sensitive to this kind of thing. I'm quite sensitive to grainy screen surfaces, and I don't find this one bad, especially amongst 4K UHD models. Sometimes they can have particularly sandy appearance to things and this sort of crystalline look, which I really don't like. This model doesn't have that. It's got a screen surface which most users will find very pleasant to use. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor, and if you've seen the review we did recently of the BenQ EX2780Q, this aesthetic will be very familiar with it because it's the same. It's actually quite well blended, but it has what I'd call a rustic appearance. So you can see the bottom bezel there. It's actually a speaker grill material. You can see the speaker itself there, one of the speakers. There's another one on the other side. It's actually a reddish brown colour, and the stand base is a powder coated metal, but it has a kind of bronze coloured finish. So this is a little bit unusual compared to most monitors, which tend to be matte black or dark grey, sometimes white and silver in places as well. A little bit different here, but to be honest, I found it quite well blended. When I was just using it, didn't really stand out. I actually kind of like it looking a little bit different. There's also this little copper coloured HDRI logo, so that's one of the features of the monitor. It's not a button, it's just a little logo there. But the buttons themselves, the OSD, that's controlled by a little joystick at the rear of the monitor. There's also a controller, a little OSD remote control, which I don't have right at the moment as I'm recording this section of the video because unfortunately BenQ didn't send it to me. And there's also a little scroll wheel there just to control the volume. This has all gone through in the OSD video, and if I do have my hands on the remote by then, I'll hopefully be showing you that remote in the OSD video. You'll also notice there's a little black box there, and that houses the sensor for the IR remote that I just mentioned. and it also has a sensor for the BI, Brightness Intelligence Plus feature of the monitor. The top and side bezels, dual stage design, so that means you've got a slim panel border that's flush with the rest of the screen. You just about see it, depends on the lighting. You can certainly see it when the monitor's switched on, but when it's switched off, as it is now, you just have to be at the right angle or look carefully to see it. But it's quite slender. And there's also the thin, hard plastic outer component. Just something I like to mention as well. The little notches, a little dot there, looks like a little section's missing. The top left and top right, both corners have it. That's just little calibration marks used by the machine that puts the panel together. The included stand, as I said, it's powder coated metal, so it's got quite a nice feel to it. But the stand itself, very limited ergonomic flexibility. You can tilt the screen backwards a bit and tilt it forwards a bit. Unfortunately, very difficult to do with one hand, so you just have to take my word for it. It does tilt eventually. There we are. It's just really quite stiff. A bit difficult to do it with such a large monitor in one hand. And you can tilt it forwards a little bit as well. The screen surface is, of course, the main feature from the front. That takes up most of the screen space. That is very light matte anti-glare, or what I'd call very light matte anti-glare. So this means that it offers good glare handling. I mean, it does certainly have matte anti-glare properties, although you might notice there are some reflections. This is quite a bright room and it's exaggerated in the video, but you will notice that the glare handling isn't quite as strong as some matte anti-glare screen surfaces. But as I mentioned elsewhere in this review, that very light matte anti-glare screen surface means that light emitted from the monitor is diffused less, and that means it has less of an impact on the image. At the side, the monitor has a pretty slender profile, quite slim at its thinnest point, bulks out a little bit centrally, but not a huge amount. At the rear, you'll see that there is another speaker grille at the top that actually houses a subwoofer, which is part of the 2.1 Trevolo sound system. It says there superior sound by Trevolo, that's just a BenQ brand. And that accompanies the two 2-watt speakers at the front of the screen, which I showed you earlier. I talk a little bit about the sound in the written review, quite decent, certainly decent in terms of the bassiness for integrated monitor speakers. The OSD controls are there, so there's a little joystick and some buttons, and that system is explored in the OSD video. There's also a central plate which you can remove, which will reveal 100 by 100 millimeter VESA holes, so little screws there which you unscrew, and then you'll have VESA holes there which you can use for alternative mounting. There's also a cable tidy feature. And there's another little removable plate here. You just slide that upwards, take it off like that, and you'll see that you can feed the cables through there. And that just keeps things a little bit neater than just having them flailing around all over the place. So you just feed them through that central gap there, then out the bottom there. You can see there's a little gap at the bottom of the plate there. There's also a K slot, and the ports are down firing. So there's a 3.5mm headphone jack. There are two HDMI 2 ports, DisplayPort 1.4, and those digital ports all support 3840 by 2160 at 60 Hz. You can use adaptive sync, specifically AMD FreeSync on HDMI or DisplayPort, and you've got HDR capability as well. So it'll read an HDR10 color signal, and you can use the VESA Display HDR 400 capabilities there. And there's also a USB-C port. Off the top of my head, I think it's 65 watt power delivery, and it supports DisplayPort Alt mode as well. And at the other side there, AC power input, so the monitor has an internal power converter and doesn't use a power brick or anything like that. And just in case you're wondering, you can remove this stand if you don't want to use it and you wanted to use the VESA holes as well. There are little buttons there, you just push them in, little spring system, and you can quite easily pull that off, and then you can use the monitor with the alternative mounting without this existing stand hanging in the way. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor. This monitor uses an IPS type panel, so contrast isn't really its main strength, but there's still a bit of room for variability when it comes to the contrast performance of IPS type panels. I measured a static contrast of a bit under 1000 to 1, following the adjustments made to my test settings. So this is in line with the specifications and my expectations for the panel. It certainly doesn't provide a deep, inky look to dark shades. If you're viewing in a dark room, you're not going to get that on any LCD without a really nice local dimming solution on the backlight or anything like that, and certainly not from an IPS type panel. So It's largely as I expect, really. Not amazing for dark atmosphere by any means, but not terrible either. I've certainly come across some weaker performance in terms of the static contrast. And being an IPS type panel, you also have to be aware of IPS glow. This is exaggerated a fair bit in the video, but that's actually quite useful because it helps my explanation of what it is and how it manifests itself. But from a normal viewing position, you can see this most strongly towards the bottom corners of the screen. You might see a little bit towards the top. It's quite a large screen. It depends where you've got your head relative to the screen. And it also blooms out more notably if you're using a high brightness setting. It would bloom out more notably if your unit has an issue with backlight bleed. My unit doesn't have a lot of backlight bleed, it does have a little bit towards that corner in particular, and that can bring out the IPS glow a little bit more. Even if you had a unit that was perfect in that respect, you'd still get some of this IPS glow. And again, as I said, it is exaggerated on the video, but you can see this sort of bloom towards this corner, which eats away at detail, eats away at the atmosphere. And towards the bottom right of the screen, it actually has a slight sort of cool green tint, whereas towards the bottom left, it is sort of a cool blue silverish tint. In other areas of the screen, towards the top right, it kind of has a slightly warm tone. And if you move around, you can see these tones changing, and you can see that in the viewing angles video, which we've got on the channel. And overall, the IPS glow on this model, it's a moderate amount. It's largely, as I usually see with IPS type models of this kind of size, it's really quite unavoidable. Unless you're sitting very far back and you're perfectly central to the screen, you're going to get this. So it's certainly something to be aware of. And if you're expecting an amazing sort of dark atmosphere, or you really like high contrast performance, then that's not really what you're going to get offered here. But as I said before, it's not terrible, and when considering the brighter shades as well, the screen surface prevents them looking horribly grainy. As I mentioned earlier, there's a fine misty graininess, but there isn't a sort of heavy smeary graininess. So most users are going to be perfectly happy with the screen surface. There aren't many people who are quite as fussy as me about that aspect, and even I don't look at this and feel annoyed by it. Coming back to the dark detail levels for a second, as I mentioned, there's the IPS glow. It does ebb away at detail in the regions that affect it, but elsewhere the detail levels are appropriate. The gamma tracking of this model is good, certainly was on my unit, and there are various gamma settings if you want to tweak that, but it means that you don't get this sort of loss of detail, and you don't get this extra detail just due to viewing angle related issues and viewing angle related perceived gamma shifts. You get them on VA models. So with VA models, you'd get what's called black crush, where there's a region in the middle of the screen where things are more blended than they should be. And then further out, especially on large screens of this kind of size, you can actually get detail levels which are too high. Details aren't as masked as they should be, and that can actually give you a banded appearance in places. It's clearer on heavily compressed video content, Netflix, some YouTube content, and most YouTube content in fact. The so-called compression artifacts can be brought out more obviously when this is an issue. TN models have that vertically as well, where towards the bottom this is quite an extreme issue. On this model, the gamma consistency is really good, so you don't get that kind of thing. I'm now going to move on to the colour reproduction of the monitor, and to start off this section I always like to use Lagom, that's lagom.nl, the website, and the test for viewing angles there. This is a really nice test for colour consistency, and that is to say shifts in perceived gamma and saturation at different points of the screen. This monitor is really very strong in that respect. It's good solid IPS type performance here. So the Lagom text, largely a blended grey, has a little bit of a green tint overall, but no obvious flashes of orange or red. So that's a good indicator that it has low viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor. The purple block, it appears a pinkish purple throughout. The pink hue is brought out more strongly by the generous colour gamut, but it's consistent. It doesn't appear more obviously pink in any particular region of the screen. Perhaps just a little bit towards the very edges, but nothing extreme at all. No obvious shifts there. The red block appears a good vibrant red throughout. Again, good consistency. If you view this shade on a VA model, you typically see that it looks a kind of duller red towards the edges of the screen, more of a vibrant red in the centre. And on a TN model, there'd be an obvious gradient, where towards the top, it would be quite a nice, deep, vibrant red. Lower down, it would appear more of a burnt red and ultimately appear pretty faded and anemic towards the bottom. The green block, that appears a good saturated green chartreuse colour. And this appears less yellow than it would on models with a narrower colour gamut, and that's because this has more of a green bias to the shade itself, and that the heavy green tones are brought out more strongly by the generous colour gamut. And there isn't any region of the screen where it appears obviously more yellow than the rest. Again, there can be some slight variances, but they can be just as much to do with uniformity issues on IPS type models like this as viewing angle weaknesses. But some IPS type models are actually weaker than others, but this is a good strong performer for this shade. Same with the blue block. Again, this typically looks good on any panel type actually, and usually shift you'd see here in brightness would be more to do with uniformity than viewing angle weaknesses. But overall, definitely a strong performance in terms of colour consistency, easily identified with Lagom.nl. I'll give some more examples in the written review of this kind of thing. I use Futurama. I watch various episodes of Futurama. That also has large blocks of individual shades, so it's a really good test for colour consistency. I'm now on Battlefield 5, and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. So again, you've got that strong colour consistency as demonstrated with Lagom. There aren't such big blocks of colour, but this still has an impact. And a given shade, the autumnal reddish browns there, for example, they appear just as vibrant in the centre of the screen as they do towards the edges. And again, that's not something you'd get on VA or TN models. And the range of colours, there's just subtle varieties of slightly different shade as well. It's not just all one red or one brownish hue. And that strong consistency helps bring out a nice subtle shade variety as well. Really nice variety of just slightly different shades, and again they have the correct identity and they're displayed properly regardless of where on the screen they're shown. And with the generous colour gamut I alluded to briefly in the Lagom test, things have fairly saturated and a vibrant look overall. So I'm running this game under SDR. As with most content you consume under SDR, that includes games you'd play under SDR, really it's designed with the sRGB colour gamut in mind. Whereas this model has a colour gamut I measured of 95% DCI-P3. That is well beyond sRGB. I believe it's a bit over 120% of the sRGB colour space if you're looking at it that way. So there's a generous amount of extension beyond sRGB, and that means that shades are represented in a more saturated way for this kind of content. But you maintain that nice variety of shades because the shades remain appropriately spaced on the gamut. That contrasts to a digital saturation enhancement. So there's a saturation function in the OSD of the monitor, for example. So more specifically, if you go in advanced, and I'm on the user mode now, so I have access to all of these settings. It's set to 50 by default. If you increase that, it increases the saturation, but that does it by pulling shades close to the edge of the gamut without expanding the gamut itself. And that means you lose shade variety, so things now just look completely cartoonish and crushed together. There isn't so much distinction between these different shades, and they just all look quite hideous, to be honest. I mean, this is an extreme example. I've pushed the saturation quite far up, but the point I'm trying to make here, and I'm just going to lower it again before I tear my eyeballs out, is that digital saturation enhancements are very different to the extra saturation you get from a more generous colour gamut. There's also a nice palette of quite lush looking greens as well, but the extra saturation is worth noting that it does have a bit of a consequence in terms of how natural the image looks, and indeed some shades don't quite look as they should or as the developers intend. So this log here, for example, there are two things. One is that the moss on the log, it has more of a sort of yellowish hue than it should, because there are some yellowish tones naturally included here, some yellow shades, some yellowish hints to the green, and they're brought out more strongly than they should be by the generous colour gamut, so it looks a little bit unnatural for that reason. Not extreme, but again, these kind of things can bother some users. And the red of the log as well, the reddish brown hues, the reds there are brought out too strongly by the gamut as well, so they don't look as neutral as they should. But I find I've communicated with users a lot about this kind of thing, and most people do like the more saturated look of things just in general, and they don't mind a little bit of unnatural look to some things, and they prefer this over sort of a more subdued appearance, because the sRGB colour space is very restrictive and things do look quite subdued if you're just following that closely. And there are plenty of shades in the real world that you're missing out on if you're sticking to sRGB. I'm not trying to take away that some users do prefer that look. They prefer things to look as the developers intend, even if they're working with a very restricted colour space. I've now made one small change. You might have just caught there, it said HDR on in the bottom right. So all I've done is I've enabled HDR on the game. This monitor responds to HDR10 content. It is VESA Display HDR 400 compliant. And what that means is you now have the colour gamut used correctly. So the moss there, for example, has more of a toned down green appearance. The yellows aren't brought out so strongly. And the wood doesn't have that reddish brown cast, so things look more appropriate. There's still a really nice range of autumnal browns and some quite vibrant shades in the mix as well. The green paint there, for example, that's well beyond what you'd see in the sRGB colour space. This is a more saturated shade than you'd see there. The icons there as well, the red for those icons, are sort of rich, deep blood red, if you like. Same for the paint on those chevrons there. So there are plenty of elements which appear vibrant when it's intended. Explosions will have this kind of look. I know there's not any fire at the moment, thankfully, because I'm not getting killed by those enemies down there. But essentially HDR has the shades that should look more muted looking more muted, whereas vibrant elements are still maintained. This monitor does offer a few different HDR settings, and I'm using display HDR at the moment, and that is by far my preferred setting. So I'll just quickly show you the others. So you'll notice that you can't adjust the brightness when you're in HDR, and you can't change the colour mode, you can't adjust the colour channels manually or anything like that. But if you go into HDR mode there, you can see there are a few different settings. Cinema HDRI, what this does is it includes the Brightness Intelligence Plus functionality of the monitor, and that means that the monitor is responding to not only the content, the HDR10 content, but it's also responding to the ambient light of the room, and it's making adjustments based on that. I don't like the adjustments it makes at all. I don't agree with them. I find that unless the room is particularly bright, I'll talk about this a bit more when I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the brightness aspects of HDR. I'm really trying to focus more on the colour reproduction at the moment with Battlefield 5, but it really gives things an obvious blue tint as well. It tends to, the colour temperature will change depending on the lighting in the room a bit, but regardless of this, it tends to look far too blue. The colour temperature is far too high, and the Cinema HDI mode also messes up the gamma. It gives things quite a cinematic look, but it doesn't look natural at all. And you might not be able to see it on the video because my camera is also compensating for things, but the screen has just become a lot dimmer now, so it seems that the setting has properly kicked in, realises I'm actually viewing in quite a dim room, and things just don't look remotely HDR-like at all. And as I said, I'm going to say more about brightness shortly using Tomb Raider as an example, but it is worth noting that this is a key reason I just don't like this setting. There's also Game HDRI, and this again uses the Brightness Intelligence Plus functionality of the monitor, so it'll really give you a very dim, non-HDR-like experience unless you're sitting in a quite bright room. And I do give specific measurements in the written review, so definitely refer to them in the contrast section, the table there, and a little bit of discussion there related to this. But really, it's not HDR-like at all, and it's making these weird changes to the image. It doesn't have such screwed up gamma, but it certainly makes changes which really seem to go against HDR, and again things just look too cool tinted and just not as nicely balanced as they do with the display HDR setting, which I'm now going to return to. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I'm using my preferred display HDR setting. So again, things appear more natural. So Lara's skin, for example, it is more toned down than under SDR. Under SDR, it has some red hues that are brought out a little bit too strongly, so it gives her too much of a tanned look, whereas under HDR she looks more appropriate. And on the video you're going to see she looks quite zombie-like, quite white, but that's because of the high luminance levels, which I'm going to come on to shortly. And there are also some yellowish green shades for vegetation, which now look more appropriately muted without this sort of overbearing yellow tones in places. So that's all quite nice, and again there's some very nice lush deep green shades. Things just look more appropriate, and fires again aren't any examples here, but they would look nice and vibrant. Some nice strong oranges and yellows as I explore in the written review, and actually the orange for this text here, the elements of text there, a nice vibrant sort of Jaffa orange shade, if you like. But moving on to the brightness and other aspects of HDR, the HDR10 pipeline calls for 10-bit color reproduction. This monitor is able to do that. It uses a 2-bit dithering stage on the monitor itself if you're using DisplayPort. If you're using HDMI, then the dithering stage is offloaded to the GPU. I'm not going to bore you to death about what exactly that means for the image here because I've discussed it quite a lot in other reviews. Suffice to say, it doesn't make a huge difference. The end result is very similar whether the GPU or the monitor is handling the dithering. But I am using DisplayPort at the moment as it happens, so the monitor's doing everything itself. And if you like to know the monitor's doing everything itself and you have the option, then yes, use DisplayPort. And what this 10-bit color reproduction does is it gives you a better nuanced shade variety. So there are lots of very closely matching dark shades under HDR, whereas under SDR things look a bit flatter for these kind of regions, for these shadowy areas and stuff like that. So this nuanced shade variety gives you a nice natural look to things, and it's very different to the look you'd get if you adjust the gamma curve of the monitor or you change the gamma, because that doesn't give you a greater variety of shades, it just shifts how things appear. You'll also notice that there's a lot of this IPS glow I was talking about before. Again, it's exaggerated quite a lot in the video at this point. It doesn't have this kind of very strong bloom I can see. It looks sort of completely flooded and quite weird actually on the video. In reality, you can see it, but it's more of a more subdued silverish glow. A bit more as you sort of see towards the top in the video, but with a bit more of a cool tone. Anyway, the reason for all of this is that the backlight is now pumping out some really quite strong luminance levels. VESA Display HDR 400 requires that the monitor can display at least 400 candles per meter squared. This monitor ticks that box, but it doesn't mandate any sort of local dimming. And this is an issue. It means that the monitor has to compromise for the brightness levels. So it's basically using a dynamic contrast function to adjust its backlight as a whole. So that's global dimming for the overall makeup of the scene, the overall levels of light and dark. So on the scene here at the moment, you got some nice bright elements from there. You got some kind of medium elements in the middle, some darker elements there. The backlight is still at a quite high brightness level. It can't just shut off to really low levels as it would if you're just showing pure black or very close to that. So it does set it to quite a high level to sort of compensate for the overall scene. And even here, you've got a mixture of shades. So you've got some very dark shades, but some much brighter shades. And again, the backlight can't just shut off to really low levels here. So it doesn't give a very atmospheric look, especially if you're sitting in a dark room as I am now. But even if you're in a brighter room, you can notice that bloom of IPS glow and you can see that things just don't look as deep as they should. On the other end, the bright shades give a nicer look to the kind of daylight scenes like this, but the luminance levels aren't extreme. I measured a bit beyond 400 candles per meter squared, but nothing extreme. So you don't get those bursts of luminance you get on some models where it goes up to say 1,000 candles per meter squared. Some even go higher. Some go perhaps to 600 to 700 candles per meter squared. Such models tend to be VESA Display HDR 600 or VESA Display HDR 1000 compliant. Not only does that mean they've got more powerful backlights that can reach high luminance levels, it also mandates local dimming. It's part of the specification. You do need to have local dimming enabled there. And that would mean that the really bright elements such as the glint there and the light streaming in from up there, they would look a lot brighter on such monitors, whereas the darker content, because they'd have local dimming, would look dimmer. But even monitors like that, unless they've got a really complex local dimming solution, they don't really make things look perfect under HDR. So you'll notice here the rock there, for example, it's not just one flat shade. There are lots of very dark shades and some much brighter shades. So again, unless you have incredible local dimming, ideally per pixel illumination, you're not going to get the kind of precision you need for that. But even so, some degree of local dimming would be preferable over the global dimming you get here. And also the reflection of light off the waxy leaf surfaces as well. It doesn't really have the sort of brightness it should, and the darker areas around the bright reflections on the leaf surface, they don't look as deep as they should. I think I've hammered in this point enough now. So going back to that 10-bit colour reproduction and things that this monitor does actually do well and advantages it does bring under HDR, it also applies to the brighter shades. So on the video you'll just see a massive ball of light, but in reality there's actually a nice nuanced variety of shades there for the brighter shades as well. And this gives a really nice smooth gradient to these kind of misty effects, the weather effects, the light effects. And this looks much more realistic than it does under SDR, where you don't get that kind of tone mapping precision. And if this is combined with effective local dimming, it does enhance the effect. So you would get more distinct look to the very bright shades versus slightly less bright shades. But even so, the 10-bit precision does help in this respect. And also the waxy leaf surface, as I mentioned before, again, it just looks like a massive pool of light there. In reality, there's actually a nice nuanced shade variety. So there are some very bright shades, some not so bright shades, and they're all displayed quite nicely. But again, that high peak luminance and local dimming would really help enhance the experience. Something I do quite like about this HDR implementation is that it allows you to adjust the sharpness. Under HDR, most monitors apply a fairly strong sharpness filter. This does it. It sets it to 10 by default, but you can actually adjust the sharpness. So 5 is a more neutral sharpness. Now the reason for the sharpness filter under HDR is it's often used to try and accentuate the extra contrast, the better tone mapping precision. Sometimes people quite like that look, other times they just don't. So it's nice having the flexibility to change that. Personally, I prefer it at the more neutral level as I've got now, but I don't find it completely obnoxious, even at a higher setting. And that's just because the pixel density is very high, and the effect of the sharpness filter isn't really as obvious as it would be on models with a lower pixel density. Then again, the fact that it has a high pixel density really means that the sharpness filter is pretty redundant. So some users may like it, some users not so much. At least you get the flexibility to actually change it here. I'm now on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. I'm running the game at a consistent 60 frames a second at the moment. You can see my frame rate towards the top right there. And it's a 60 Hz monitor, which means that you don't get the kind of connected feel as I describe on high refresh rate monitors running at high frame rates. And that describes the precision and the fluidity when you're interacting with your character, interacting with the game world. So you don't get that kind of thing, the edge and connected feel. But the connected feel is good as far as 60 Hz monitors go. It has a low level of input lag, which does aid the connected feel. I measured around 3 milliseconds, so it's really not an issue. On this monitor, has a nice low signal delay. The other aspect to consider is perceived blur, and there's an article on the website all about responsiveness which covers this in some detail. There's also a bit of a summary in the written review talking about this. But essentially 60 Hz monitors, you get a moderate amount of perceived blur due to eye movement, and it's actually your eye movement that causes most of the perceived blur you'll see on a modern monitor. But there's also pixel responsiveness to consider. That can certainly add to perceived blur if there are weaknesses there. And this monitor doesn't have any obvious weaknesses in terms of its pixel responses. Really, most of the pixel responses are performed fast enough for an optimal 60 Hz performance, or they provide just a little bit of what I call powdery trailing in places. So that's really just a small contributor to perceived blur, very small contributor on some pixel transitions. Some pixel transitions show some slightly more pronounced weaknesses, but I do say slightly more pronounced. There are actually some very good demonstrations in the written review. If you look at the UFO motion test for ghosting pursuit photography there in the responsiveness section, there's some good demonstrations showing that if you've got a darker background shade, you can get this sort of slightly heavier powdery trailing in places. When you're gaming, that means that there are just some transitions, just a slim number, not many have this issue, where you get a little bit of extra perceived blur. And you get a little bit of this powdery trailing. You can see it at the top of this thatched roof, for example, but it's not extreme at all. And this is really sort of the slower kind of pixel transitions you'll see on this monitor. If you compare this to a VA model, and I like to use this theme when I'm talking about responsiveness on VA models, because there are plenty of high contrast transitions. So you've got these darker shades with brighter backgrounds and vice versa. And these create obvious smeary trailing, or to me, obvious smeary trailing on VA models. So competing VA models, even the faster ones like the Philips 328E1CA, they do have this smeary trailing in places, or they've got lots of this heavy powdery trailing, which is just, that can be quite eye-catching. But on this monitor, you don't really have any eye-catching weaknesses, just these slight weaknesses in places. So nothing I'd worry about, a much more solid pixel response experience than you'd get on computing VA models. And really it's about as good as I've seen on a 60Hz IPS monitor, just in general. And there aren't any substantial benefits you'll see from a TN model. And that's because most of the pixel transitions are performed optimally or close to it. There's also a little bit of overshoot, inverse ghosting. So you can see a little bit of halo trailing, which means that the trailing is brighter than the background or the object color. You can see that behind the tree trunk there. It isn't extreme though. I don't find it eye-catching when I'm just playing the game normally. If you're super sensitive to overshoot, you can adjust the pixel response setting. So I'm using high at the moment, AMA high, and you'll find the settings in color advanced, AMA. If you set it to off, you will get rid of that overshoot, but instead you get a lot more of this, what I describe as powdery trailing, and it has more of an extended appearance in places. It's actually what I describe as smeary for these transitions up there. So really this is a trade-off that very few users are going to make, and the pixel overdrive is really very well optimized using the high setting. If you like to abuse your eyeballs, you can use the premium setting. And what this will do is it will get rid of any of this powdery trailing, which really just affects a slim number of transitions, but instead it replaces it with unsightly overshoot, lots of very bright halo trailing. Should be quite clear on the video. You'll see it around the tree there, for example. This bright trailing is a lot more distracting than the slight powdery trailing for some transitions you get with the AMA high setting, so really, in my opinion, it's a clear choice. You also get lots of dirty trailing in places, and that means that the trailing is darker than the background or the object color, and it stands out for that reason. So you can see it around the light there, for example. Back to my preferred AMA high setting, and that disappears. The monitor also supports adaptive sync, and that means that you can use AMD FreeSync if you've got a compatible GPU or system, and it has a variable refresh rate range of 40 to 60 Hz. And what that means is if your game drops below 60 frames a second, the monitor will match the frame rate with its refresh rate. And the reason it does that is to keep tearing and stuttering at bay. So if you don't have adaptive sync active and your frame rate dips like this, if you've got VSync enabled, you'll get obvious stuttering. And I say obvious, sensitivity to this varies. It's obvious to me, but to some users it really isn't. Or if you've got VSync disabled, you'll get obvious tearing. And again, caveat, obvious to me. So it's nice to have adaptive sync enabled to get rid of these interruptions. Unfortunately, I'm using an NVIDIA GTX 1080 Ti at the moment. On some monitors, you can use what's called G-Sync compatible mode, which is essentially very similar to FreeSync, and you can use it on adaptive sync monitors. Unfortunately on this one it doesn't actually work properly. I've now increased my graphics settings. You can see that the frame rate is a little bit above 40 frames a second, and this happens. Screen blanks. And this happens frequently when adaptive sync is active and it's within its variable refresh rate range. So unfortunately that essentially renders it completely unusable. This doesn't happen with AMD FreeSync, and I'll show you that with my AMD GPU very shortly, but you can quite understand that it's a completely unusable setting. Even with this, I do actually prefer using my NVIDIA GPU because it's a lot more powerful and it's easier for me to get consistently high frame rates, but it would be nice if it did work. It isn't NVIDIA G-Sync compatible certified or anything like that, so BenQ never claimed that it would work, and unfortunately the technology doesn't always work. And just as a quick side note, the screen's probably going to blank out again, but you can see in the information section there it says current resolution at 46, so that means that it's 46 Hz that it's running at, so it does show you if the technology is working, adaptive sync, whether you're using AMD FreeSync or trying to use it as an NVIDIA user. So that at least gives you an indication that the technology is active and doing its thing. I'm now on Battlefield 5 on a different scene. I've got my AMD GPU in this system. You can probably hear it's a lot louder than my NVIDIA one, unfortunately. But the nice thing is that I'm now using AMD FreeSync. So you can see that the screen doesn't blank out, and the frame rate counters again towards the top right of the screen there. You'll see it very rarely meets 60, which is when it's green, 60 frames a second. It quite frequently dips below that. There's a lot of fluctuation. And actually, a lot of the time in this particular scene it goes very close to the floor of operation, 40 frames a second. Sometimes goes a little bit below that, and that does unfortunately cause tearing or stuttering. Because I've got VSync enabled, it actually gives me stuttering rather than tearing, but there's a definite disconnect as soon as the 40 frames a second is breached and you go below that. So the effective range of operation is quite narrow, but it's completely typical for 60 Hz monitors to have that kind of range of operation for adaptive sync. In fact, some give you a narrower operation range, 48 to 60 Hz instead of 40 to 60 Hz. Something to be aware of with adaptive sync in general, and it does apply to this monitor, is that usually variable overdrive isn't used. It certainly isn't used in this case. If you have monitors with G-Sync modules, so that's proper G-Sync module, full fat G-Sync monitors in other words, they use variable overdrive, and what this means is the pixel overdrive is retuned as your refresh rate decreases, so that will happen alongside your frame rate if you've got adaptive sync active or G-Sync active in the case of a G-Sync monitor. Without this, you're left with pixel overdrive, which is really just tuned for 60 Hz, and as your refresh rate drops, things aren't tuned optimally and you tend to get an increase in overshoot. This can be really obvious in some cases. On this monitor there is an increase in overshoot, but it's not extreme. I mean, the overshoots, as I showed you earlier, at 60 Hz isn't a big issue, and it does become a bit more obvious as your refresh rate decreases, but it's not really particularly in your face even there. There's a little bit of halo trailing around the branch there, for example. I'm on a different scene just so I can show you a bit of a more specific example of the overshoot. So I've got the game running 60 Hz at the moment. It's got 60 frames a second, and you can see some overshoot. You can see some halo trailing behind that object and also behind the palm tree, or I should say to the left generally when I'm moving my character to the right. Not super obvious by any means, not eye-catching, and this is probably the most eye-catching example in this scene. However, if I now increase my graphics settings, the overshoot is now more pronounced. There's clearer halo trailing. But again, it's not particularly obnoxious as far as these things go. What I'd say I actually generally notice more readily from this drop in frame rate is that the connected feel drops off, and indeed the level of perceived blur increases, and that's because I now have a significantly lower frame rate. That isn't something that adaptive sync or FreeSync can help you with. You still get a lower frame rate, and it is nicer to have high frame rates. And with that said, I actually prefer using my NVIDIA GPU, my GTX 1080 Ti, because it's a lot more powerful than my Radeon RX 580, and it's easier for me to drive high frame rates. With the AMD GPU, I still prefer high frame rates, so I would make quite intense visual sacrifices to try and get that. Whereas with my NVIDIA GPU, I can get a pretty solid 60 frames a second with just maybe some occasional dips below that. Obviously it depends on your GPU, the games you're playing, the settings you like to use. But it's just to say that AMD FreeSync isn't the be-all and end-all, and even with my NVIDIA GPU not supporting adaptive sync, I prefer using it. It's also worth noting that sensitivity to tearing and stuttering varies, so not everyone finds adaptive sync to be such a wonderful technology. It's not really such a game changer for everyone. Really, it depends on your sensitivity to tearing and stuttering. And just a final thing to note, you can use HDR at the same time as AMD FreeSync. So it says HDR on. I've just turned HDR on. That's not a problem. You can have HDR on at the same time. To wrap up then, the design of the monitor I find quite agreeable overall in terms of the aesthetics. Quite surprising actually when I saw pictures of the monitor and videos of the monitor, or indeed before I'd actually seen one with a similar design in real life, the EX2780Q. I thought that the sort of brown coloration would be a bit weird, but actually it's quite subtle and kind of like it, it's just a little bit different. I also like some of the unique features of the monitor. The remote, you don't often get an OSD remote, so that's a nice little feature. It does make using the OSD more convenient. The other unique feature, I guess, is the Brightness Intelligence Plus functionality and things related to that. Didn't like that at all. Completely useless. I've used that on various other monitors before. I mean, some users might find it useful or might find some utility in it, so I don't want to completely knock it, but just for me, it didn't hit the spot at all. The integrated speakers, pretty good as well, quite usable. I actually use them quite a bit myself, and that's because it has an integrated subwoofer, which really does help give a lot more richness, a lot more fullness, a lot more bassiness to the sound output. So it just makes it sound better than most integrated monitor speakers. And the little volume control there is a neat little feature as well, but it's actually easier to just adjust the volume with the OSD remote. Of course, on the downside, very limited ergonomic flexibility, but if you do want more of that, you can mount it with 100 by 100mm VESA compatible solution of your choice instead. The screen size and the pixel density, very nice combination, something of a sweet spot in my opinion actually. So it gives you a nice level of clarity and detail for suitably high resolution content. Text looks nice and crisp. I also found that the screen surface was more agreeable than most 4K UHD monitors I've used, and that is a good thing because something I'm quite sensitive to. It's not perfect, it does have a little bit of a light misty graininess as I like to call it, but it doesn't have a smeary appearance, it doesn't have an obvious sort of layered appearance as some monitors have, or just any strong graininess, anything like that. And that's certainly an issue I have with quite a few 4K monitors I've used. It was nice to have a better experience in that respect on this one. Elsewhere, in terms of the contrast performance, really quite in line with my expectations as well. Static contrast around 1000 to 1 as specified. Moderate amount of IPS glow, quite typical for an IPS type panel of this size. So that's really a key advantage to the VA models, the VA alternatives to this one. But where this monitor has a big advantage is the colour reproduction. The consistency of the shades was excellent, as I'd hoped for from a decent IPS type panel. So you don't get the kind of shifts in saturation or perceived gamma that you get on VA models towards the edges and bottom of the screen, or TN models further down the screen. Of course, it's really VA models you might have in mind when you're comparing this to other direct competitors, because there aren't any 32-inch 4K TN models, which is probably a good thing to be fair. And even if you're comparing something like the Philips 328E1CA, which is one of my favoured 4K VA models at the moment, that monitor has good colour consistency for the panel type, but even then it clearly falls short of this model. The colour gamut is generous as well. I measured 96% of the DCI P3 colour space. It meant that shades within the sRGB colour space, that's most content you consume, it appeared with extra saturation, looked very vibrant, but it looked very varied thanks to the consistency of shades and the fact that it's a wide gamut, achieving that extra saturation, not just a digital saturation enhancement. As I've said before, this is a look which most users will quite like. It's not for everyone, but it does have an sRGB emulation mode if you prefer. Rec 709 isn't quite perfect. I had to tweak the gamma a bit using an ICC profile because you can't access the gamma settings. But having said that, some users might quite like using the Rec 709 setting even with the 2.4 average gamma, because it actually adds a little bit of extra depth without the same kind of level of saturation you get with the normal native gamut. It also lends itself well to HDR content. Good coverage of the DCI P3 colour space, because the DCI P3 is the target for HDR10 content. This monitor put in a reasonable HDR performance as far as the VESA Display HDR 400 standard goes. So it doesn't give you anything near a full fat HDR experience. You don't get any advantage in terms of contrast. It doesn't have local dimming. And the brightness level, although it's a little bit raised compared to under SDR, it's not massively raised. So you get a little bit above 400 candles per meter squared. But again, no local dimming, everything's done globally, so it can't compensate for intricate mixtures of light and dark. But it was still nice having the colour gamut put to good use. 10-bit colour reproduction as well, enhanced tone mapping, that helped at the low end and the high end, and just in general to improve the nuanced shade variety, so that was a nice thing as well. Some of the other HDR settings I didn't find appealing at all. Anything with I after it means that the Brightness Intelligence Plus feature is used, and as I mentioned earlier, not a feature I like, makes various adjustments I don't agree with. The responsiveness of the monitor was good as far as 60Hz monitors go. Obviously 60Hz refresh rate, somewhat restrictive in terms of responsiveness compared to high refresh rate models, but there were no obvious weaknesses in terms of pixel responsiveness. A little bit of powder trailing in places for some transitions, especially with the darker shades, but if you compare that to what you see on competing VA models, nothing of that sort, no kind of smeary trailing, not loads of heavy powdery trailing or anything like that. So the weaknesses were far less pronounced, and really it's a pretty solid 60Hz performer. It was also aided by low input lag, so it doesn't have a problem with signal delay or anything like that. Adaptive sync also supported, worked well with AMD FreeSync. Unfortunately, on my NVIDIA GPU, it just gave me lots of screen blanks, so the technology was unusable. I'm not going to hold that against BenQ because they don't ever claim that it does support NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. It isn't certified as such, and unfortunately, this kind of issue can occur and various other issues. So overall, I feel that there's quite a lot to like about this monitor. If you're after a vibrant and consistent color experience, you want to have that nice pixel density, the resolution, and you've got the budget for it, then it's really going to be a strong contender in my opinion. If you have a more restrictive budget or you really prefer stronger contrast over the consistent and vibrant color output or the stronger responsiveness, then you might consider one of the VA alternatives instead. So that's really all there is to the BenQ EW3280U. Be sure to check out the full review on pcmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.